Hi, and welcome to the 57th in this Middle Eastern Islamic history series. It's the second part of our discussion of Zionism and the mandates of Palestine and Transjordan. So, the rules for those of you who may be unfamiliar, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in religion, science, history, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. I'm a lay person who's very interested in these topics, and I'll endeavor to provide you a secular perspective, that is to say, a perspective that doesn't bias either side, as hard as that may be. Another thing is that this is obviously going to be a sensitive topic, like all the other topics in the Middle Eastern history series. Please, let's be respectful of the topic. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and I will respond in real time. What I like to say is that these presentations, these classes will be a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. That's the 101. And if you know some of this information, the more of it you'll see, you'll be able to go into greater depth, and that's the 201. I also say that I have a 2-hour hard stop, meaning that at 9 p.m. Eastern time, whatever we don't cover today, that'll just be rolled over into next week's session. You don't have to worry about missing additional slides. Obviously, if we have questions, those I'll answer, and I'll continue any discussion that we're having, but I will not show any new material. This is sort of a difference from our traditional rules. When I put dates below a person, if they are a politician, those are the years of service. That's a general, that's a president, that's a prime minister, that's a high commissioner. So those dates are their years of service. But if it's a philosopher, a theologian, a rabbi, an imam, those are their dates of life, right? Because they don't have a set beginning and end of service. This, like all the other members of the Middle Eastern history series, will be recorded, and you can watch those recordings on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get updates on all the different series we do, as well as being able to watch the other 56 entries in this series to sort of catch you up on all the history you've missed. And if you feel motivated after seeing the quality of this program, Zoom, PayPal, and Meetup all cost money to maintain. So please, we appreciate PayPal donations. And if you don't have a PayPal account, we also accept have a coffee. And I'll provide those links at the end of the presentation. All right. So last time we talked about a significant amount of change and governmental turnover that had occurred in the Levant region over the last 2,000 years, where it stopped being part of the Roman Empire and became part of the Rashidun Caliphate. The Rashidun Caliphate gave way to the Umayyad Caliphate, Umayyads to the Abbasids to the Seljuks to the Fatimids, the Fatimids to the Crusaders to the Ayyubids, the Ayyubids to the Mamluks to the Ottomans. And so you can see you don't have a consistent rulership over this piece of territory, and the designations that it was given differed at different periods in time. The earliest use of the term Israel, of course, comes from the ancient states that used to exist there even before the Roman Empire. And the term Palestine really first comes from Muawiyah's government of Syria, where the military division, or jund, that existed in the northern part of what is today Israel-Palestine was called Jund Palestine, or the military district of Palestine. Now, over that time, in the latter part of it, right, that Ottoman 400 years between 1517 and 1917, we have a significant degree of autonomy that exists in this territory, given that it's so far away from Constantinople. And so you have the rise of different clan leaders. And we talk about Zahr al-Umar, who's probably the most prominent of these clan leaders in what is today Israel-Palestine. And Zahr al-Umar was an Arab, but an Arab Sunni Muslim, but he had relations with the Bedouins, who are themselves also Sunni Muslims, but nomadic, in contrast to the majority of the Arabs who are settled in towns or cities. And in addition to having relations with the Bedouin, he also encouraged settlements of Jews and Christians because of their financial and economic expertise. And so we have this sort of culture that developed under the Ottoman period, where there would be Sunni leaders like Zahr al-Umar. He's probably the most famous and most adept. But we have others who controlled smaller areas at different times, and those leaders would be responsible for creating an environment where, while Muslims were legally superior, the other faiths and religions were allowed to build religious structures, create religious communities, and more or less practice freely, but for the payment of certain taxes. But this system under the Ottoman Empire became disrupted at the beginning of the 19th century, primarily because of Napoleon's invasions and subsequently the invasions of Muhammad Ali, both of these invasions coming from an Egyptian power base. And it was during Muhammad Ali's control that we begin to have persecutions of the Jews. Some of those persecutions were done by what we would anachronistically call Palestinians, and some of them were done by the troops coming from Egypt. The looting in Sfat or Safed is an example of the former, and the Battle of Hebron is an example of the latter. We also have, during the Ottoman period, the development of these land laws. And one of the major functions of these land laws that we're going to see is that it instantiated what had existed in the Levant region for a long period of time, which is that you had a certain population that owned territory, and that population was usually ethnically, socially, or religiously different from the population that farmed on that land. So, for example, if we look at the Hauran region in Syria, we have a region where the Druze, which D-R-U-Z-E, which is a distinct Arab ethno-religious group, owned a lot of the land, but it was Christians and Muslims, settled Christians and Muslims who farmed the land. And so these land laws ended up codifying that these people who lived on the land, worked the land, really didn't own much of the land. The land was owned by these lords who often lived in different towns and different cities from the areas where the land was situated. Another piece that's important to remember is that the Circassian genocide led to a large number of Circassians resettling in the Middle East, although it was a small percentage of those that fled. Most of them settled in Turkey today or in the Balkans region. Those 10,000 to 30,000 or so that did settle in the Middle East had a very important position because they would often be put in very violent areas where different groups were feuding. And so because of the loyalty that the Circassians had to have to their new government, that was the only reason that they would be able to be set down there and be able to live after undergoing the persecution that they did in Russia. They gave total and complete loyalty to those governments. And even today, you can see, for example, these are the Circassian Guards of Jordan. And we're going to talk a little bit about this, is that in Jordan, the Circassians became part and parcel of the governing authority throughout not only the end of the Ottoman period, but into the creation of the Kingdom of Jordan. So another key piece that we've talked about is that there was this renaissance or Nahda that was going on in the Arab world. And the Arabs, if we look at them in a global sense, were sort of divided between two ideological perspectives at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And the first one that we've seen a lot in Egypt and we've seen in Iran as well is Islamic modernism. This idea that Islam is a faith of the future. And in that way, Islam understands science, literature, technology, all of these kinds of things. And it has in fact been Muslim rulers who've been refusing to take on the task of actually improving the condition of the Muslim people in an Islamic way. And in fact, in Europe and the West in general, those have been more Islamic places. These are places more in keeping with Islamic values. They just don't happen to be practicing Muslims. They chanced upon this by accident. And so Islamic modernism was the idea that we should reinstantiate that in the Muslim world. Muhammad Abduh, who you can see on the top, his famous saying was, "I went to Europe and I found Islam, but no Muslims. I came back home and I found Muslims, but no Islam," right? This sort of idea. So as much as Islamic modernism was key in Egypt and in Iran, it had very little effect in Israel-Palestine. And Israel-Palestine was actually much more in keeping with the larger theme of Syrian nationalism. And by Syrian in this case, we mean Balad al-Sham, or Greater Syria. So Syrian nationalism is a nationalism that would envision a single state for Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And you had the majority of intellectuals forwarding this movement coming from what is today Lebanon, and most of them were Christians. And in many ways, the Syrian nationalism and later Arab nationalisms that would come from it, that sort of ethnic identity, that regional identity, was very attractive to many of the Christian minorities in the Levant region, because it allowed them to participate in that national expression and not be an ostracized other, as they had been in the Ottoman period and continued to be, but for the Edict of the Gulhane and Hatach al-Mayun during the 19th century that tried to give them more and more equal rights. And after we set up the discussion about the Arabs on the one side, we then began to talk about the Jews. And at a fundamental level, the Jews believed through the majority of their exile period, let's say AD 135 until the 20th century, that of course, 20th century would be disputed. Many Jews would still say that the Jewish people are in the exile period because the Messiah has not come yet, but that's a different piece, where we don't have a Jewish polity in the land of Israel/Palestine. That the majority of Jewish rabbis throughout this period believed in the idea that there was a theological ban on resettlement, that the Jews were banned by God in keeping with some of the parts of the book of Deuteronomy and rabbinical exegesis therefrom, that to not create a polity in the historic land of Israel, that the Jews were not pious enough to merit that. And that at the end of days, when the Messiah himself would come, he would permit the creation of such a state. And throughout the 19th century, we see several kinds of ways that leaders try to move beyond this sort of theological ban on resettlement. In the Jewish context, right, we have Shabbatai Tzvi, Tzvi Kalisher, and Yehuda Alkalai. Shabbatai Tzvi was himself a messianic candidate, so he didn't have to skirt the theological ban. He said he was the Messiah and encouraged people to move. Tzvi Kalisher and Yehuda Alkalai believed that we were in the end days and that the Messiah's coming was so proximate that it was permitted for Jews to return. But you can see in the Jewish side of this, it's explicitly playing within the bounds set by that theological ban. On the Christian side, you have Napoleon and the speech he never gave. You have Herbert Aldersmith and the wider British Israelite Society, and Anthony Ashley Cooper and the wider Christian Zionist group. And these groups of Christians that operated in the 19th century had their own Christian religious reasons for believing that a Jewish state should be created. Napoleon, in the sense of his aggrandizement and his ability to take on the role of a Messiah in creating a Jewish homeland, the role of Cyrus, as he saw in the Bible as well. Herbert Aldersmith, as a British Israelite, he believed the Jews were he believed that the British were a lost tribe of Israel, and so the Jews were his kinsmen, and so he was fighting on behalf of his kinsmen. And Anthony Ashley Cooper and other Christian Zionists believed that the end times would not come until the Jews were restored to a home in their historic lands. Notice how the Christian views have really nothing to do with Jewish wants or desires, and the Jewish views are entirely religious at this period. So one of the fundamental changes in the Jewish community that occurs in Europe is that they are exposed to the Enlightenment, the Romantic movement, and there's a debate actually as to whether the Haskalah or the Jewish Enlightenment is a Jewish Romantic movement or a Jewish Enlightenment movement, because it has elements of both of these. But you saw this shift And this led to a number of Jews becoming secularized. And those secular Jews began to see themselves as part of an ethnic group because their Judaism seemed to transcend the borders of simple religious practice. There seemed to be some sort of community nexus that held them together despite their different countries. And they all faced, to a certain degree, systemic discrimination within Europe. It varied from city to city and place to place. But there was a huge issue with integrating the Jewish population. And that question, as put to the wider audience, especially the wider audience in Germany, where these subjects were much more openly debated, was called Judenfrage, or the Jewish question. Could Jews be a part of the European society? And the answer that some Jews ended up coming to was that Jews couldn't necessarily be integrated into a European society because Jews were not meant to be in Europe. Jews were meant to be in the Middle East, and they should reform an attachment to their ancestral homeland. And Leon Pinsker is the founder of Chovevei Zion, or the Lovers of Zion, and he sought to inculcate that belief. That, along with funding from Baron Rothschild, led to the first settlements of what was called the New Yishuv, or the New Settlement. Those are Jews that were coming from Europe or from America to the land of Israel, land of Palestine, in order to begin to create their own settlements there. And ironically, at this same time, there were a lot of millenarian rabbis in Yemen. And so you had Yemeni Jews who literally walked from Yemen through what is today Saudi Arabia to get to what is today Israel. And they actively assisted the European Jews who were coming in terms of farming and agriculture, making the Yemeni Jewish community one of the oldest of the new Yishuv communities, even though most Mizrahi communities came in the 1950s. And of course, the number of Yemeni increased during that period as well. What really starts Zionism, this secular movement for the creation of a Jewish polity in the land of Israel, was Theodor Herzl's view of the Alfred Dreyfus court-martial, which we discussed in a lot of detail. And as a result of that, he felt that Jews did not have a place in Europe. He felt like he had the answer to Judenfrage, that Judenfrage could never be answered positively in the Jewish question. And you can see in his title of Der Judenstaat, he says, Modernen Lösung der Judenfrage, a modern solution to the Jewish question, right? The Jewish state is the solution. And he did everything in his power to try to achieve that. As we pointed out last time, there were a number of Jews from different perspectives that rejected Zionism. In fact, Zionism would not become a majority position in the Jewish community until after the formation of the State of Israel. But that opposition generally divided into these four camps: the Orthodox, who were continuing the theological ban; the integrationists, who believed that Jews did have a place in Europe, that the answer to Judenfrage was yes, that Jews did have a place. There were the autonomists, who argued that Jews had a place, but they should have a certain degree of limited self-government, the same way that other minorities in larger empires were beginning to do. And the Bundists, who believed that the society at current was created by capitalists, intended to create fission and break up the different workers. And so by coming together in unity, Jews and non-Jews would recognize themselves as having more in common because of their station in the capitalist hierarchy than they would be differentiated by their religious beliefs. Not swayed by this lack of popular enthusiasm, the World Zionist Congresses began to be convened, primarily in Basel in Switzerland. And these set out the conditions for another wave, another aliyah or immigration wave to the land of Israel and of Palestine, and the establishment of what were called kibbutzim. These kibbutzim are socialist communes. In many respects, they have a unified living situation. And the Jews who were part of these aliyot, or waves of migration, were called chalutzim, or pioneers, because they were pioneering the land They were farming as had never been farmed before, primarily because they had no idea what they were doing, and the farming was not terribly lucrative. So they ended up needing to have Arabs assist them with farming, as well as the Yemeni immigrants that we discussed earlier. Many immigrants who made Aliyah actually ended up going back to Europe. Depending on the immigration wave, it could have been as high as 50%. Because they were not cut out as white collar workers to do this heavy lifting and agronomic work. And finally, we talked last time about cultural Zionism, this idea that Jewish identity as it existed in Europe was somehow anemic, that it didn't have all of the aspects that are needed for an actual Jewish culture to develop. And so Ahad Ha'am, his birth name Asher Tzvi Hirsch Ginsburg, wrote about Jews discovering who they were by walking through the ancient places that had been described in their Bible, about having a connection to certain places and events, and that way they could truly interpret their own Jewish identity and create Jewish art, Jewish literature, Jewish masterpieces that were built on a commonality of Jewish experience, as opposed to somehow a refraction or a reflection of the experience of the Gentiles around them. On the more indigenous side, you have Albert Abraham Antebi and Nissim Yaakov Malul, both Middle Eastern Jews, who saw the Jewish identity as being part and parcel of the Arab milieu in which they sit. Antebi was an Ottoman patriot, and he even fought during World War I for the Ottoman forces. Malul was not similarly predisposed towards the Ottomans, but he felt that a connection with the Arab community was critical for the Jewish community to survive. There's a point here that the Bund idea of workers uniting despite their race would apply in the United States to whites and African Americans. That's absolutely true. And in fact, socialists in the United States who would have considered themselves Bundists if you had asked them, Jewish socialists, I'm saying, also argued that the racial distinctions in the United States were as a result of the capitalistic hierarchy, and therefore needed to, therefore a socialist revolution or a socialist large-scale reform was necessary in order to end the racial disparities between whites and blacks, as well as between whites, blacks, and Jews. And finally, on the Arab side, we have the development of the Palestinian identity, which is what I'm calling Palestinianism. That's not to say that the Palestinians did not consider themselves distinct from, let's say, Egyptians. We know that Levantine Arabs were calling themselves Shami, both to themselves and in external documents. For example, migration between any part of the Levant and Egypt was recorded on Egyptian letters as indicating that the person was Shami, not that they were an Ottoman subject, which would have also been true, but it recognizes that there was a distinction that was meaningful, at least to the Egyptians and to the people of the Levant. But Palestinianism is this idea that the people of Palestine itself have some sort of identity, and that really comes out of this confrontation with the British, this confrontation with the nascent new Yishuv, and the new Yishuv's push towards the creation of either a Jewish national home or an independent Jewish polity. One of the important things to recognize is that because the Palestinians were forming as an ethnicity and they were forming as a group, they didn't have an organized hierarchical structure, which the new Yishuv would have, right? Because the new Yishuv is creating itself from a perspective of leaders joining up to create a movement, whereas Palestinianism is emerging from different individuals locally, all beginning to reassess their identity. And so what ended up happening, which is what typically happens with movements that develop organically like this, is that you have conservative members in society becoming the dominant leaders in this new movement. They ascribe to the new socio-political identities, and then they begin to be the ones in charge of enforcing them. And so you begin to see a personality conflict between the two most powerful, if we can use this term anachronistically, Palestinian families, the Nashashibi family and the Al-Husayni family. Now, the Nashashibi family is represented here by their patriarch, Raghib. You can see him in the lower left-hand side, white shirt, black cap. And next to him, just to his right, in the black shirt and a white cap, is the leading patriarch of the Al-Husayni family, Amin. And these individuals were completely opposed in terms of how they wished to manifest their Palestinianism, that the Palestinians should have some kind of political control over their own destiny. Raghib Nashashibi was seen as being more conciliatory, more moderate, and more open to negotiating with the Zionists and with the British, whereas Amin al-Husayni was seen as being directly militarily confrontational. Nashashibi argued that a direct confrontation with the Zionists or with the British would result in the defeat of the Palestinians and therefore their loss of total power, whereas negotiation could work, and Amin al-Husayni foreclosed the possibility of negotiation ever achieving anything. And so you ended up having these two individuals on the Arab Higher Committee, which was basically the representative, if again we use this term anachronistically, the Palestinians, with regards to the changing situation in the mandate, that these individuals would not come to a unified perspective that they could advise the British or the new Yishuv in their negotiations with those entities. There's a question, is Jesus technically from Nazareth? Remind me about that at the end. I can address that later. It's not directly relevant to this, but that would be the Nazareth. All right, so one of the things that happens in World War I is that we end up seeing the Ottomans making the first move against the British in Egypt. As we're going to discuss when we do our second reprise on Egypt on the 1st of December, one of the things that had happened, ironically, in the 19th century is that the British had colonized Egypt functionally in 1882 after the Anglo-Egyptian War. But Egypt was still technically a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire and an intrinsic part of the Ottoman Empire, according to both countries' constitutions, despite the fact that Egypt had basically been running its own affairs since Muhammad Ali Pasha, and the British had basically suborned those affairs since 1882. But the British ended up cutting Egypt off from the Ottoman Empire at the start of World War I and declared Egypt its own independent sultanate that was fully under British control, which makes entirely too much sense if you just listen to it for too long. And so invading this independent, not independent country was Ahmed Jamal Pasha, the governor of the Levant under the Ottomans, and he tried to march towards the Suez Canal. The British were able to resist and push back most of the distance across the Sinai. And in so doing, the Ottomans were no longer able to advance on Egypt, and the front remained more of a standstill. If you want to know more about that interaction, I advise watching episode 45, where I covered the Middle Eastern theaters of World War I. But what's important about World War I in terms of the Levant region is that we now have differing agreements about what territory would be allocated to which of the states. And we talked about this last time, that the Hussein McMahon correspondence doesn't actually discuss what any unique future for the land of Israel Palestine, although it can be interpreted as such. And You also had the Balfour Declaration, which had a very different orientation and effectively prompted the Zionists to believe that there would be a Jewish national home. And finally, after the conquest of Palestine, the British wanted to create a mandate structure in the land of Israel, Palestine, in order to create some sort of functional governance there and to control the holy sites that they thought were of particular interest and import. All right. So once we get to the mandate itself, we have the Zionists that had begun to settle in the new Yishuv were very angry during what was called the Occupied Enemy Territory Administration, the OETA period that we discussed last time, between the end of World War I in 1918 and the signing of the San Remo Declaration in 1920. So the OETA was British military governors holding the region before it was allocated, and in San Remo, the territories of the various mandates were set. And so you had this mandate for Palestine, and the mandate for Palestine had no clear eastern boundary. The eastern boundary was certainly east of the Jordan River today, but it wasn't clear how far into the desert it extended. And the current borders of Jordan against Saudi Arabia are a creation in 1922. So it extended somewhere out there, but not very clearly how far out. And the Zionists were particularly angered by the three generals in succession who ruled over this mandate, primarily this occupied territorial administration in the southern jurisdiction, because these individuals were either pro-Arab or neutral on the questions of Arabs and Jews in the region. They explicitly wanted somebody who would be more Zionist-leaning. And during the 1920s, the British made clear that they were interested in enforcing the policy that the Jewish region of that the Jewish people would have a national home in the Mandate of Palestine. So you ended up with the appointment of the first Viscount Herbert Samuel, who was a British Jew and a Zionist, to be the first governor, the first High Commissioner of the Mandate of Palestine. Naturally, he engendered a lot of antipathy from the Arab Muslim community because of his partisan politics with regards to the Zionists. And ironically, in order to deal with the Muslim community, he had to appoint a representative therefrom. And he appointed Amin al-Husseini, right, that leader, that paragon of the one of the two most powerful families in the region, to be what he called the Grand Mufti, or the most important Muslim representative. Now, in order to understand the formation of Jordan, or Transjordan rather, which also occurs during this regime, we need to go back a little bit. We discussed that there was, in episode 54, a government led by Faisal I, Faisal, son of Hussein ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, who was the king of Syria. And as you can see from the central map here, all those areas in green were at least nominally territories loyal to the Hashemite crown, which extends from its capital in Damascus all the way south through much of what is today Jordan, at least the inhabited portions thereof. Now, as we discussed, the Syrians lost this war against the French. The French wanted to create a mandate in Syria from their OETA, and it was increasingly clear that no matter what concessions Faisal could have made, it wouldn't have been enough. And we discussed the entire history there, as I said, in episode 54. But what's important is that now when the French take over Syria, there's a power vacuum in those southern territories, the territories that are the modern country of Jordan. And so you have this weird situation going on. the British decide that it's not worth actually trying to colonize the Transjordan, the region on the far side of the Jordan River. But at the same time, they didn't want the Zionists causing more problems there, so they couldn't leave it under the control of Herbert Samuels. And it's worth taking a second to address why Herbert Samuels was chosen. The British were invested in creating a Jewish national home, and they were invested in supporting the Zionists. They had argued in the Balfour Declaration that they would do so, and they thought that it was in their best foreign policy to continue that. Some may see it from a financial perspective, wanting to make sure that the loans that they received during the war were favorably treated, and some see it from a prestige perspective, that they wanted to create a colony in the region that they felt like they could control more effectively. But regardless of the reason, Herbert Samuels was known to be somewhat partisan towards the Jews, and so Lord Curzon in the Foreign Ministry of the British Empire explicitly delimited the Jordan River as the eastern border of the Jewish area of settlement. But there was sort of a wrinkle here, because the British had been granted two mandates. They'd been granted the mandate of Palestine and the mandates of Iraq, and they couldn't just get a third mandate. So they sort of snuck Transjordan in as another part of the mandate of Palestine, in which Jews would not be settled and the High Commissioner of Palestine would not govern. So what did the British do in terms of actually preventing the region from simply collapsing under the weight of no governance? So what Lord Curzon did is that he actually went to the various cities, or sorry, he sent representatives to the various cities along the eastern bank of the Jordan River, like Assault, which you can see there, and began to form local governing commissions, almost turning this region into a bunch of city-states. Now, that in itself was not a serious problem on its own, but you have to realize that this area abuts a growing country, Saudi Arabia, which we discussed in episode 52, a country that had just conquered its northern rival, Jabal Shammar, and therefore was posing a direct threat to the British. So the British needed a functional solution beyond these city-states, but they couldn't involve the High Commissioner of Palestine. They couldn't create a new mandate, and it would be too expensive to send British troops there. So what they ended up doing is they ended up seeing that Hussein ibn Ali had another son. The Sharif of Mecca had another son, and that was Abdullah. And Abdullah was a very charismatic personality. As he moved through the various towns underneath these individualized governing councils, he was able to create an aura around himself, an aura that the British saw as positive and stabilizing, especially with a border against the increasingly potent Saudis that the British had not been able to formulate a good relationship with. And they also saw that his popularity was basically unchallengeable. So they decided to recognize his authority. And so on the 11th of April, 1921, Abdullah was declared emir, or prince, of the Emirate of Transjordan. And so you can see that proclamation there. And as soon as he came into power, a number of the minorities in the region became the immediate support system for Emir Abdullah. In particular, you had the Circassians that we've talked about a little bit earlier, and Said al-Mufti, who was one of the leaders of the Circassian community, pledged the Circassian males to the defense of Emir Abdullah, ensuring that he would be able to secure his power, despite the fact that of course Emir Abdullah was ethnically Arabian. He wasn't ethnically from Jordan. He didn't represent any of the families from Jordan, but the defense of the Circassians effectively meant that he was shielded from any possible attacks in the early period from those who may be disaffected from him not being from a local group. Now, Emir Abdullah and Lord Curzon had disagreements about what territory should belong to the mandate of, the Emirate of Transjordan. As you can see from the Ottoman borders, the Vilayat of Syria included the Sanjak of Hauran, and the Sanjak of Ma'an. And if you look at the Sanjak of Ma'an, and compare it to modern boundaries, you'll see that the southernmost portions of what is today Israel are included in that. And Emir Abdullah argued that he should be entitled to those borders. That said, Lord Curzon pushed back and argued that the Mandate of Palestine should also have a Red Sea coast. And so the borders were stabilized at exactly where they are now. And so we end up with this Emirate of Transjordan being created. And the Emirate of Transjordan is unique among the various mandates that we're going to see in the Middle East, in that the British actually gave the Jordanians a little rope to hang themselves with, as opposed to trying to completely control everything they ever did. Primarily because they only saw the region as a useful bulwark against the Saudis, and not a region that had any resources or anything worthy of a military commitment on their own. And Emir Abdullah I ruled in his own right for 30 years as an absolute monarch, but there was a Transjordan High Commissioner that was appointed as soon as the emirate was declared. As you can see, St. John Philby there began to take on Arab dress, and he even converted to Islam as part of his tenure being the High Commissioner of Transjordan. The British and the monarchy wanted to establish a normal functioning relationship, and throughout the 1920s negotiated between themselves how they would effectively do this, only signing a treaty in 1928. But that treaty effectively ceded to the emir all affairs of state domestically. International relations would be in the hands of the British, but in terms of the organization of the various provinces, the religious laws that he would institute in the country, the possibility of voting, all of these kinds of things were entirely up to the emir's discretion. And in so doing, he set an election for the Council of Ministers on the 2nd of April, 1929. Now, these ministers did not have significant power. They were more of a consultative body than an actual legislative body. Remember, Jordan is an absolute monarchy. But this does show a degree to which Abdullah I was ruling, at least with the nominal consent of the governed. There's a question as to whether St. John Philby is the ancestor of, I forget his name, I think it's Nick Philby, who was the British spy who was found out. Yes, he's his father. So going back to the mandate in the West, Herbert Samuel began to allow for large-scale Jewish immigration to the areas to the west bank of the Jordan River. And that Jewish immigration was quite substantial. Now, we haven't really talked about population sizes yet, but the population of Transjordan was about 320,000 in this period, and the population of Palestine at the inception of the British Mandate was about 800,000. During the 1920s, significant numbers of Jews entered the country, raising the Jewish percentage of the population from less than 10% to nearly 25%. And this wave of immigration did not go unnoticed by the Arab majority of the population. By Arabs, we're talking about Muslims and Christians as well. These populations thought, quite reasonably, that should the Jewish numbers swell too much, those numbers could ultimately result in the Jews being either the majority or creating their own political apparatus, something that the Muslim and Christian Arabs were not interested in. So during this period, we sort of have to understand what the Zionist world looked like within the land of Israel, and rather the Mandate of Palestine. So we start having a relationship between the old Yishuv, the Jews who were in Palestine from before the British came in, and the new Yishuv, those that were coming, especially in the 1920s, but even a little bit before then, from Europe. And I chose two individuals who really represent that. You have Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Uziel, who was himself a Jerusalem-born rabbi of Sephardic heritage. And he was the first chief rabbi of the old Yishuv to really be welcoming of the new Yishuv and try to integrate them, despite the fact that the new Yishuv really did not understand the local dynamics. Uziel was particularly unique in that he stressed that we should understand a distinction between halakha, or Jewish law, and the creation of a functional political polity, and that a Jewish state or Jewish engagement in politics shouldn't be constrained by what was halakhically permissible, because that was a question for a halachic state, not for a polity that is created outside of those bounds. And so he gave a significant amount of rights to women in terms of their political and economic ascension. He tried to resolve disputes in favor of all parties concerned, trying to balance needs of Arabs and Jews. And he decided to try and mix the communities, as difficult as that was, between the new Yishuv, which was overwhelmingly Ashkenaz, and the old Yishuv, which was majority Sfard or Mizrahi. There's a question of where did the new settlers immigrate from? They immigrated from countries like Poland, Russia, Germany, Czechoslovakia. They immigrated mostly from Central and Eastern European countries. But probably more interesting, actually, than Uziel is the rabbi on the Ashkenazi side. And that's Rabbi Avraham Kook. And he's particularly interesting because, as we pointed out, the Orthodox had a theological ban on resettlement. But Kook pioneers a new philosophy, which is that the creation of the Jewish national home, and through that extension, the Jewish national state, is the first stage in bringing about the Messianic redemption. So instead of saying the Messiah is already coming, right, as Yehuda Alkalai had said, he's saying that the Messiah isn't yet coming, but we can bring it about. And we can bring it about by manifesting the creation of a Jewish state in which such a Messiah could rise. And so Rav Kook is a minority within the Orthodox Jewish world in Europe for supporting the creation of a Jewish state, even under the conditions that it is not a halachic Jewish state, a Jewish state that rules according to Jewish law. And so he is supporting the secularizing agenda, saying that the secularists who are behind it don't even realize their importance in the religious mission, that they are, for want of a better term, it'll come to me later, that they were unknowing witnesses to the creation of a Jewish halachic state in the future. There's a point here that that the United States closed off Jewish immigration in 1924, which of course increased the number of people who were coming to Palestine. But you also have to remember that the earliest immigrants had a significantly harder time than later immigrants because the infrastructure wasn't there. So each wave of immigration became larger, both due to permissibility and prevention on other side, as well as ease of movement. The other thing is that we have to realize that the new Yishuv was not a unitary group. They had different political aspirations and beliefs. The majority of them were what were called labor Zionists. They were coming from the socialist side, very similar to the Bundists that we described. And these labor Zionists are best represented by Dov Borochov, who was born in Ukraine. He ended up dying in Ukraine as well. But he spent a significant amount of time with the Chalutzim, with the Jewish pioneers in the land, in the Mandatory Palestine. And in his view, and in the view of many labor Zionists, there was a significant problem with the Jewish world, which is that the Jewish world was organized primarily in an inverse pyramid, that there were, and it's the stereotype, of course, that people are well familiar with, There are 85 billion Jewish lawyers, bankers, doctors, engineers, you name it, and 2 Jewish farmers. So regardless of how accurate that is, it was certainly a prevalent view among labor Zionists. And it was key that in order for the Jews to express a true socialism and to have a true sense of nationhood, as that idea was understood in a romantic idea, the Jews needed to be a folk. They needed to be a people on the ground. They needed to be a peasantry. They needed to be with land. And so you begin to have this view in labor Zionism that the Jews who come to the land need to be the farmers. They need to connect with the soil of the earth. As we've discovered with the first and the second aliyot, or Jewish immigration waves, that usually doesn't turn out terribly well for the migrating Jews because doctors, lawyers, and bankers generally don't have expertise in farming. But the labor view that the Jews had to do this further foreclosed the possibility of Arabs who were the traditional farmers of the land farming. And so what had once existed, especially during the first Aliyah, where Arabs would farm as sharecroppers to the Jews in much the same way that they had farmed as sharecroppers to either Sunni Arabs or Druze or others who were more removed. Now the Arabs were pushed off of land that Jews were now farming, which created conflicts between those two groups. On the flip side, leading a minority of the Jewish community, the new Yeshuv at the time, were those who were what were called revisionist Zionists. And probably the most famous of these is Vladimir Jabotinsky. He was born in Russia, but he went often by the code name Zev. And Jabotinsky argued that the Jews and the Arabs were necessarily going to be in a certain degree of conflict. And that conflict could be managed by a modern capitalist state that was expansionist and militant, but it couldn't be resolved through socialism such as the labor movement was providing. And he also argued that the labor movement's discrimination between a Jewish folk and an Arab folk, and that or Jewish people in the romantic sense and an Arab people in the romantic sense, necessarily would create a conflict. It wouldn't create a shared romantic nationalism, that there had to be something that was established more on the basis of interdependence than through separation. There's a set of comments about the Shanghai Jews. Yes, the Sassoons in Shanghai are my cousins. And I've mentioned that labor Zionism was dominant, but how did that really manifest in terms of how the mandate was built economically? Probably the most famous implementation of labor Zionism, and it still exists today, it has about 800,000 members today, is the Histadrut, or the General Organization of Workers. And the Histadrut was a massive labor union, and this labor union existed in all areas of the Israeli economy, from agriculture, which of course comes naturally, to the construction ministries, to economic developments. For example, you can see there Bank Hapoalim, or the Activists Bank, which was one of Israel's first major banks. It's part of the Histadrut. You have Tzim, which is an Israeli cargo container company. Its employees are part of the Histadrut, and so on and so on. And through this regulation of the economy, you began to have the creation of large established companies that could effectively provide for the Jewish population and immigration that was coming into the land. You also had increasingly the creation of militant organizations designed to defend the Jewish polity, because as the number of Jews increased, so did the fractious reactions with other Arab populations. In 1925, former soldiers of the Zion Mule Corps and the British Legion began training and creating their own militias called the militia called the Haganah. In 1941, the Haganah created an advanced corps called the Palmach, and part of it split off to create the Irgun, which, unlike the Haganah, which was primarily a militia, and the Palmach an expanded form of that, the Irgun was something closer to a terrorist organization, bombing and attacking civilian areas. And the Lachi is a subdivision of the Irgun that split off because of interactions during World War II. The Irgun decided to be on the side of the British during World War II, and the Lachi believed that such a thing was capitulation. Now, on the Arab side, we see a lot more disorganization. You have the Arab Higher Committee, which is formed around 1936, but the Higher Committee is a representative group, right? It's representing those major families in Palestine, including the Nashashibis and the Al-Hussainis. And they don't really set up any militant development until 1947. That's the Holy Jihad Army. The Syrians, as we pointed out in episode 55, created the Arab Liberation Army as a pseudo-Arab League army to fight alongside either Arab forces directly or alongside other Palestinians. And both of these groups were not coordinated with each other. Both of these groups were poorly managed and did not have nearly as many recruits as the Haganah did. There's a question of whether Ben Gurion was part of the Irgun. No, he wasn't. You're probably thinking of the name's not coming to me. The Israeli who, yeah, Menachem Begin. Thank you. And then there's a comment here that somebody's father-in-law was president of a labor union that was active in the Histadrut, and that's fantastic. All right, so we've talked about sort of the European view, especially last time, on what Zionism was, but it's worth also talking about what the Mizrahi view was at the time. And so I sort of have 4 different Mizrahi perspectives that that sort of color what we generally see. So we have Menachem Saleh Daniel. He was a parliamentarian in the British Mandate of Iraq, and before then he was part of the Ottoman government. He was asked by a number of Zionist representatives if he would like to help start the Zionist movement in Iraq, and he declared that it is not the place of Iraqi Jews to support Zionism because it would alienate them from their Muslim neighbors, and it would cause unnecessary dissension and harm to the Jewish community. So it's not, so we have numerous statements from him talking about how Zionism is a problem, but almost always these statements are couched in the idea that the reason that Zionism is a problem is not because Jews shouldn't go back to the land, it's not that Jews shouldn't set up a government, but that it was inopportune for Iraqi Jews, given the current logistics, to support that. And that view is actually quite common throughout Iraq, that Zionism is a problem because it will affect us poorly, not because there's something illegitimate with the movement from a theological perspective, from an organizational perspective, or otherwise. You have Ezra Menda. This is not actually a picture of him. I couldn't find a picture of Ezra Menda. He was part of the Damascus Youth. He was based in Syria. And during the 1930s, he wrote extensively about how prevalent Nazism was in the Arab world. In many cases, Nazism found several parallels with Arab culture. And to be clear, just because Nazism was popular doesn't mean that all Arabs were Nazis. It just means that this was a movement that was gaining strength, and it had a certain attractiveness to the Arab population. And that attractiveness really came from 2 distinct sources. The first is that the Nazis were very clearly positioning themselves as the enemies of the British and the French, the colonial usurpers, and the Arabs saw this as an alliance of convenience. But there was Nazi propaganda tailored to the Arab world that explained the concept of a master race in the terms of the Arabs being a superior race, because those Arabs were individuals who had received the Quran. Therefore, they were more special than other populations. And this was a belief that exists to a limited degree in the Arab world, but it had not been codified in this way before. And that idea made it very easy for them to accept that in a European context, perhaps the Nazis were, the Nazi Germans, the Aryans were a master race, and in Syria, the Muslims are a master race. And in both cases, the reason that these empires fell in World War I, were not able to achieve their national dreams and aspirations, is because of that fifth column in their midst, right? The Jews who are living in their own country. And in many ways, this helped solidify and organize what had been previously low-level anti-Semitism throughout the Levant region into something more concrete. And so from Ezra doesn't really opine on Zionism per se, but he argues that the position of the Jews in Syria is definitely in serious danger because of the spread of these Nazi ideas about Jewish insubordination. There's Ali Kaduri, who was knighted by the British. He is an Iraqi Jew, and the Kaduris and the Sassoons had a significant amount of business in China. And from those businesses, those individuals were able to send out donations. So Ali Kaduri built numerous centers throughout the Mandate of Palestine, as did Elias Sassoon. Now, these two individuals didn't explicitly support Zionism, but what they did do is they provided financial funding for a lot of the institutions to be created that would ultimately allow the state to come into existence. So there was and this was very common among wealthy leaders in the Arab world, to donate to religious centers, especially those in Palestine, both before and after the mandate was declared. And so this was sort of a tacit way of supporting Zionism without necessarily coming out in favor of the politics of it. There's an argument here that those with Nazi leanings also believe the Axis was best poised to be victorious. That's absolutely correct. And probably the biggest investment that Kaduri made, as pointed out in the comments, is the agricultural shuk, or the agricultural market that he created. And finally, the last voice I want to talk about is Murad Farag. He was an Egyptian nationalist, and he was also an ardent Zionist. He argued that the needs of the Jews all around the world to return to their homeland is irrefutable. It's just that he felt that as an Egyptian, he did not have that need. He saw himself first and foremost as an Egyptian, and that in Egypt, his Jewish identity was not a problem or an issue. But understandably, that was not the situation of Jews everywhere else in the world. And so he saw no conflict between supporting a Jewish state in Palestine and supporting the Egyptian people. He also made it very clear that Egyptians were only Arab in the sense that they spoke Arabic, that Egyptians were not the same people as those that existed in the Levant, any more that French and Spanish people are the same. So as we move towards the beginning of the 1930s, we begin to have increasing despair from the Arab population as the number of Zionists and members of the new Yishuv continue to increase. And so you begin to have both religious and secular opposition to this growth. From the religious side, you have Izzeddin Qassam, who was an Islamic sheikh, and he ministered in many of the poorer areas of the Mandate of Palestine, arguing that the Jewish presence was designed to undermine the Arab national consciousness, to be an insult to Islam, and to be a movement in the retrograde of Palestinians. He also pointed out that the development and urbanization of Palestine during the 1920s, and especially with many Palestinians losing their land, right? You have labor Zionists who are effectively buying land from absentee landlords. becoming those landlords. And instead of following the traditional route of using the Arabs as their sharecroppers, they've now pushed them out and into the cities. So you have a lot of Arab poor, and they're seeing their way of life disappearing. They're naturally more susceptible to these kinds of arguments. On the flip side, you have Fawzi al-Qawqji, and he is, as we pointed out, a member who takes place, a member of the Great Syrian Revolt of 1925 to 1927. And when that is quelled, he flees to Palestine in order to not be arrested by the French authorities. When he's there, he helps organize a militant group, and that becomes the Arab Liberation Army. So combined, the sort of ragtag militia of Izzeddin Qassam and the increasingly organized militia of Fawzi al-Qawqji, and finally a third group, which is the Al-Hussainis, led by Abdul Qadir, and his militia fighters. The three of them, although very disorganized, begin a revolt throughout Palestine. And this revolt was not an organized attack by a commanding officer. These were small internecine battles that would occur in town X or town Y, several British dying, and something much closer to the insurgency that we saw, for example, in Northern Ireland, than any kind of direct confrontation. As a result, the British had to resolve this much more effectively with a police function, and by reaching out to families like the Nashashibis, who were more willing to make peace with the British. So the British put together a coalition in order to deal with the Arab revolt. The first part of that coalition was using their own troops, and you can see troops leading Arabs out of Jerusalem who were either connected or believed to be connected with the revolt. The next part of that coalition was reaching out to families like the Nashashibis, who had inherited the mayorship of Jerusalem, had inherited a number of other key roles in the Palestinian community to try and keep more Palestinians calm. He reached out, the British reached out to the Haganah, that Jewish militia, to work as police in helping to repress the Palestinian militias. And so the Haganah created a division of military police to service the British called the Notrim. And after 1939, effectively, the rebellion was put down, and in no small part because of Izzeddin Qassam's death. There's a question of how were Arabs and Muslims different? Arabs imply anybody who speaks the Arabic language and who is part of that culture, which could include Christians. And in fact, Christians were a not insignificant minority. We're talking about maybe 10% of the population, 15% of the population were Christians. So because of this revolt, you start having what was called the Peel Commission, where Lord Peel was asked to determine a future for the Mandate of Palestine, how to resolve the violence and prevent another sort of rebellion from the Arabs. And so Lord Peel set up the commission, and he met with both Zionist representatives and representatives of the Arab Higher Committee, that is, that representative group of Palestinians. He would have met with them at the same time, but the Arab Higher Committee absolutely refused to attend any meeting with Zionists in it. We'll see this as a recurrent theme. And Lord Peel, after meeting with both groups, decided to create a partition plan, one of many partition plans in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this one, like several of them, predates Israel or Palestine as functional, internationally recognized states. So after the violence had subsided in 1939, the British also they proposed this separation. The Jews were willing to accept, the Arabs were not, and so it was never implemented. But in 1939, the British decided that the most effective way to prevent these revolts from ever occurring was to publish a white paper that would limit Jewish immigration to the Mandate. Of course, the timing of that white paper quite detrimental to the Jewish cause in the long term, given that this was the period in which Nazi persecution in Europe became most accelerated. And therefore, there was strong opposition among the Yishuv members about the implementation of the white paper, regardless of that context. But that context made it especially callous seeming on the British part. There's a question about the British rule being a port plus Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The reason that the British wanted Jaffa, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem is because of the Christian significance of those cities, and therefore they would have the ability to access them and keep them away from conflict. That was the thought process. Now, the Jews and the Arabs were not the only populations in Mandatory Palestine. You also had a number of different minorities. And so the new Yishuv and the Arabs ended up trying to court these different groups. Now, I've been using the word Arab, but to be entirely clear, we're talking about the settled Arabs. These are Arabs who either live on farms or they live in the cities. Bedouins are also Arabs, but Bedouins have an entirely different culture than the settled Arabs did. And the Zionists noticed this very quickly, especially in the Galilee region, where a significant percentage of Zionist new yeshuvs were built. And so they began to reach out to the Bedouins as a community that they could share water with, share food with, because by and large, they weren't competing over land. The Bedouins are semi-nomadic. And the Bedouins, in turn, have a long militant history, and that also became useful in forging long-term contacts. Another relationship that the Zionists cultivated pretty early on was that with the Circassians. There are only a few Circassian villages in the territory of Mandatory Palestine, and it's unclear why the Circassians were drawn to the Zionists much more easily than to the Arabs, especially because the Circassians are also settled Muslims. They're just not Arabs. But in many cases, it's believed that the Circassians had a reasonable command of Russian, having been expelled from Russia. And a lot of the members of the Yishuv also had a decent command of Russian. And so that helped formulate the links between those two communities. Another community that existed were the non-Arab Christians, like the Armenian population and the Maronite population that existed in certain areas of the country. The Maronites tended to stay out of Israeli politics until the Lebanese Civil War in the 1980s, but the Armenians were much more effectively courted by the Arabs. The Christian Arabs and the Armenians felt like they shared a certain reaction to the increase of Jews in the territory and the increasing inability to go to certain parts of Jerusalem. So the Armenians became more and more connected to the Arab side of the coin. And finally, you had the Druze. The Druze, it took a while for them to really choose a side in the confrontations between the new Yishuv and the Arabs. But generally speaking, the Druze ended up in territories that became part of nascent Israel. And as a result of that, and as a result of good dealings with the new Yishuv, generally during the Mandate period, the Druze became very supportive of Israel, and that support tends to be the highest among non-Jewish Israelis. It's worth pointing out that there is a distinction between the Galilee Bedouin and the Negev Bedouin, in that the Galilee Bedouin generally live in semi-arid regions and therefore encountered new Yishuv homesteads, and the Negev Bedouins generally lived in the desert and therefore did not encounter as many Zionist homesteads. Accordingly, most of the Bedouin that fought alongside the nascent country of Israel would fight from the Galilee, not from the Negev. And to this day, there are still there's a much better integration of Galilee Bedouin into Israeli society than Negev Bedouin have been. And there's a question of whether the Druze were Christian or Muslim. No, they were Druze. And we've talked about Druze religion several times in the past lectures. Its origins are in Ismaili Shiite Islam, but it has a number of innovations that put it outside the fold of Islam. All right. So the next thing, of course, is that World War II happens, and Mark covered that really well in the Syrian side. World War II has a very minimal impact in the mandates of Palestine or Transjordan. But there is some impact, and it's worth pointing out that after Jordan has these elections in 1929, it's pretty much smooth sailing through the 1930s. There are some developments, but generally speaking, the relationship between Britain and Transjordan becomes concretized with the appointment of military advisors to Jordan. And so you have John Bagot Glubb, who is affectionately called by the Jordanians as Glubb Pasha. And he is in charge of creating the Arab Legion, which is the most advanced Arab military force, probably in the Middle East at this time. And the Arab Legion was deployed in the Anglo-Iraqi War. You can see them working very hard here to not shoot their own planes. This is actually in a Jordanian Air Force base. So they didn't see that much action, but they saw more action than probably any other group of allied side Arabs. And at the same time, they were given drill and techniques that were more advanced than anything that was occurring in the various militias. Another piece that we should remember is the Circassian and other commitment to the Jordanian monarchy. And so, for example, you can see here, this is Alauddin Arslan. Alauddin Arslan was an ethnic Chechen who came with the Circassians. And so he became part of the Arab Legion. And still to today, he's considered a war hero in Jordan for his long military service. And he's representative of the fact that over 70% of the first members of the Arab Legion were Chechen or Circassian. These Russian, if we use that term politically, not ethnically, these Russian immigrants to the region. And in 1946, right after World War I, the British decide to accept King Abdullah I's request that he achieve independence and his own state. And so on the 25th of May, 1946, he declares independence over the Jordanian airwaves, and the British sign with him a treaty of alliance, which basically means that the status quo has not actually changed, but that Jordan is functionally independent and can now call itself a kingdom. Understandably, some parties, like the Soviet Union, were not terribly convinced by this gracious show of British imperialism, and delayed the integration of Jordan into the international community, such as the United Nations or having international embassies, until 1955. But after 1946, while British advisors still remained in Jordan, in fact, British advisors would not leave Jordan until 1957, like Glubb Pasha, Jordan, from the British perspective, was independent after 1946. Independence for Palestine was much more difficult. During World War II, the policy among the Zionists was best encapsulated by the words of David Ben-Gurion, who was probably the leader, we could say, of the larger Zionist organizations operating in Mandatory Palestine. And his view was, we should fight the white paper as if there was no war, and we should fight the war as if there was no white paper, meaning that operations in Mandatory Palestine against the British would continue in order to get more immigrants into the country, these immigrants who were coming in illegally called ma'apilim, and that all efforts would be done to resist limits on immigration. But at the same time, the Nazis were necessarily an enemy of the Zionists. The Zionists saw the survival of fellow Jews as being critical and important. And so they would fight alongside the British in in dealing with the Nazis. And you can see, for example, Hannah Senesh, she was a Hungarian Jew. She had been part of the new Yishuv, and she actually went back, paratrooped into occupied territory in Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, before she was able to execute her mission, she was arrested by Hungarian border guards and tortured, where she refused to give up information on her comrades, and she was murdered finally by the Nazi regime. But what's important here is that you have this sort of dual situation. Now, there were Zionist groups that refused to play ball with Ben-Gurion's general détente against the British, and that's where the split between the Irgun and the Lachi came. The Lachi argued that no alliance with the British was permitted under any circumstances, and continued to attack the British, and perhaps even controversially, reach out to the Nazis for help in defeating the British. Now, following the war, the situation intensified, because now that the Nazis were no longer a threat, the full state of anti-British activities could resume. Those activities resulted in a number of different attacks. The Haganah itself tended to take more direct military target style attacks, for example, causing train derailments and other activities. The Irgun, which, as I mentioned, is a Jewish terrorist organization, went after the King David Hotel, which was being used by the British as a command center. That said, they attacked it when it was in use by both commanding officers and civilians, and over half of the fatalities, and there were 91 fatalities, half of those fatalities were non-British individuals, non-British persons. And because of these attacks in 1946, the British began to wall off significant sections of Jerusalem, which they called Bevingrads, after Bevin, the British foreign minister in Grad, from Stalingrad, right? So you have this sort of walled city in the heart of Jerusalem, in the heart of a number of Israeli cities, and British soldiers, which had been previously permitted to go anywhere they want in the mandate, were required to stay in these Bevingrads. There have been debates as to why the British took such an anti-Jewish tone, even when they knew that, to a certain degree, that the genocide in Europe was going on. And the argument from Bevin that is most compelling to me in terms of what their motivation was, is that they could be sure that the Jews would stand up against the Nazis. The Nazis had locked the Jews into a natural antipathetic state. But the Arabs were not similarly locked, and the British desperately needed Arab oil. And so what they needed to do was court the Arabs not to support Jewish public opinion and not to support Jewish lives. There's a question of what portion of Palestinian villages and peasants were dislocated by Jordanian forces as opposed to those who may have fled or moved by settlers of the nation's Jewish state, particularly around Jerusalem. Are today's Palestinians Jordanian or members of independent Arab clans? Okay, at this point, Jordanians are not removing Palestinians. And we don't have a large-scale Jordanian depopulation, as we will with the creation of the nascent state of Israel from the Jewish side. And so that, I guess that sort of answers that. And then are today's Palestinians Jordanian or members of the independent Arab clans? Jordanian is sort of a loaded term, and we'll sort of get into why that is. Most Palestinians today are ancestors of people who were in the Mandate of Palestine in 1948. I think that's probably the clearest answer I can give to that. It's more that there are many Jordanians who are ethnic Palestinian than it is that there are Palestinians who are ethnic Jordanian. All right. So now that the war is over, presumably, right, you would think that Jews would be able to return back to their homes in occupied Europe. That was overwhelmingly not the case, and that wasn't the case for several reasons. One, anti-Semitism didn't just magically disappear just because the Nazis were no longer enforcing it. And so a lot of Jews who tried to go back to their communities discovered quite quickly that their communities were no longer terribly welcoming of them. Another major issue was that the Nazis had often given property or businesses that had belonged to Jews to non-Jews as part of reallocation. And when those Jews wanted that back, those who had either received it or even in many cases paid for it didn't want to give it back to the Jews. They considered themselves to be victims in that sort of sense. They had bought or acquired something that, they didn't ask where it came from, but they didn't think twice about it, and they didn't want to give it back. So you had this sort of sentiment around it as well. And so you had a lot of Jews in Europe who were in these displaced person camps. Some of them wanted to come to the United States. Some of them wanted to go to other places, but many of them wanted to go to the Mandate of Palestine. And the British was still enforcing the White Paper of 1939, which resulted in many Jews continuing to do the ha'apala, or the illegal immigration by boats. Those that were caught were detained on British-controlled Cyprus until they began to be released in 1947 and 1948. On the diplomatic side, one of the interesting things is that Weizmann was able to convince both Truman and Andrei Gromyko of the Soviet Union through his attaché Abba Eban, in order for both of the Cold War superpowers to support the creation of a nascent Jewish state. In the case of Truman, it was really Weizmann's personality that seems to have convinced him more than anything. It doesn't seem like Truman was terribly motivated to create a Jewish state of his own free will, and there are even rumors that Truman's wife was herself anti-Semitic. From Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet motivations were primarily to unseat the British in the Middle East and to weaken British imperialism. And on the second hand, the Zionist institutions like the Histadrut were probably the closest to any socialist institution outside of the Soviet Union. And so, in his view, an independent Jewish state would be more aligned with the Soviets. The view that these two superpowers had led to their pushing for the UN resolution, and even before then for a UNISCOP, or the United Nations organization that would begin to assess what should be done about Mandatory Palestine. Now, UNISCOP was supported by the Zionists, who spoke to them directly, and was not by the Arab Higher Committee. And so most of their perspectives and views were necessarily colored by the fact that the Arabs refused to work with them. And accordingly, you ended up with a partition plan, as you can see in the central image here. That partition plan would give to the Jews the areas in orange, and would give to the Arabs the areas in yellow. And those borders roughly correspond, as you can see on the map on the left-hand side, with the areas of large Jewish settlement. Jewish settlement is usually indicated by different shades of blue. Arab settlement is indicated by different shades of green, and the red is areas that generally have no settlement of any kind. White areas are areas that hadn't been parceled out, but you can see that most of the Jewish settlement was along the coast, and that was what was primarily granted. But after the vote, which a number of the parties who voted in favor have argued that they were coerced either by the United States or by the Soviet Union, that vote resulted in a 2/3 approval of the UN partition plan and permission for the Israelis to declare a state, and for the Palestinians, as we can call them anachronistically in both cases, to declare a state. Now, that was released on the 30th of November, 1947, and as a result, you ended up seeing clashes occur throughout Mandatory Palestine between Arabs and Jews. Probably the most devastating attack against the Jews in this part of the conflict, which is called the Palestinian Civil War of 1947 to 1948, was the bombing of Ben Yehuda Street, which is a main thoroughfare in Tel Aviv. I believe over 40 Jews died, and several more were injured. And when the last of the British troops left on the 14th of May, 1948, Ben-Gurion then came the next day in Tel Aviv to declare the state of Israel into existence, which was a move that was very controversial at the time. Israel's generals say in hindsight that they thought that the country had a 50-50 chance of survival if it declared independence, primarily because if it declared independence, Arab troops from outside of the country would consider an invasion. In fact, the Secretary General of the Arab League said that a war of conquest would be waged, similar to that of the Mongols. So on the 15th of May, right after the declaration was read, you have an invasion from the Arab armies of Egypt in the south, Jordan and Iraq in the east, and Lebanon and Syria in the northeast. And the bulk of the fighting was over the route from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The Jews, despite Jerusalem not being part of the 1947 partition plan, the Jews very much wanted to control Jerusalem, both because of its strategic position and because of its strong religious heritage, and finally because over half the population of Jerusalem was a Jewish population. And so a significant part of the war was trying to get convoys along the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem highway, not to be attacked from the mountainous regions on either side of the river valley. A number of attacks were waged on the Arab towns that existed along this area, and some of those Arab towns either capitulated or made treaties with the Zionists. Others were attacked, some more violently than others. On the positive side, you have the city of Abu Ghosh, which, after an initial resistance to the Jewish forces, eventually was willing to come to an agreement with them, and Abu Ghosh today remains as an Arab city within Israeli borders. On the other side, you have things like Deir Yassin, where the Irgun massacred around 106 Palestinians and depopulated the town. But the hardest fighting, of course, occurred in the old city itself, and the Jordanians fought block by block. The Arab Legion, led by King Abdullah I of Jordan and his British minister Glub Pasha, were the most effective fighting forces in the entire Arab side of the campaign. And they were able to push the Jewish forces out of the old city of Jerusalem, expel Jewish settlements within the territory under Jordanian control, and force the Jewish forces to only be able to hold on to the western part of Jerusalem, the new city of Jerusalem. It's worth pointing out that despite King Abdullah having superior forces, he was almost on a side by himself. Most of the Arab leaders in the war were very suspicious of Abdullah because they believed correctly that he wanted to annex the regions of Palestine that he could into Transjordan and not create an independent Palestinian state, especially one that would be headed by the Al-Husseini family, who he deeply despised. In particular, he despised Hashemite Husseini, the leader of that family, and who had been part of the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 39, and was leading the Holy War Army in this conflict. One other point that I'd like to make before shifting from here is that Yigal Allon, who is one of Israel's generals, argues that it would have been possible for Ben-Gurion to launch an attack and take the entire West Bank from the Jordanians towards the end of the war, in 1949. But Ben-Gurion was afraid of losing the support of Western countries, especially the United States, which, while the United States was embargoing the country at present, could possibly be supporting Israel in the future. And so he didn't want to overstep the possibilities, and he left the West Bank alone. The next thing to sort of address is the Northern Front. And so the Northern Front is run by the Syrians and the Lebanese, as well as the Syrian proxy Arab Liberation Army. Now, the Arab Liberation Army was created as a proxy by the Syrians in order to not directly involve themselves with the Palestine conflict. Shukri al-Quwatli, the president of Syria, and I use that term president lightly, believed that the Syrian army would be no match for the Haganah, which is interesting, but because the Syrian army is an organized army and the Haganah is a militia, but the Haganah had managed to call up a significant number of Israeli reserves and had been drilling in an organized fashion since 1925. The Syrian army was much more new, much more divided, and much less effective of a fighting force. And as we discussed more in detail in episode 55, the Syrians were barely able to make any headway. They took over a few towns in the northeastern part of what is today Israel before being defeated at Degania Aleph and Bet and being forced out of the country. More embarrassing still was the war that the Israelis were able to push against the Lebanese in Operation Khiram, which took place between 20th and 29th of October in 1947, where Israel conquered the entire north of the country, all the way into Lebanon, up to the Litani River. And the attack here resulted in the ethnic cleansing of a significant percentage of the Palestinian and Arab, Palestinian Arab townships that existed in this region. Despite that, of course, the Jezreel Valley still remains an Arab majority region within Israel, but a number of towns were removed as part of this. And following an agreement between Israel and Lebanon, Israeli forces withdrew back to the mandatory boundary. There's a question of there was a certain amount of pragmatic adjustments and goals and strategies throughout the independence war rather than a clear set strategic goal. Each of the fronts was operating independently, and there was a strong degree of autonomy within the Haganah. I talk more about the Israeli disposition of forces and sort of the reorganization, especially after May 15th, because there was a shifting of it being Haganah into being the Israeli army, the IDF. And so that organization led to a number of command structure differences and things like that. But suffice to say that most of these fronts were operating quasi-independently and sending messages to Ben Gurion and the Zionist command in Tel Aviv about what they were planning to do and coordinating and so on. But by and large, each command was operating quasi-autonomously. The Southern Front was the war against Egypt. And the war against Egypt was rather difficult because the Egyptians were able to basically isolate Israeli command in the southern portion from Israeli command in Tel Aviv. And so a significant part of the war, especially in October of 1948, was actually reuniting these two parts of the Israeli command. You can see that in the map in the center. And the Egyptian Air Force needed to be neutralized in order for Israeli ground forces to be most effective. The Egyptians were also able to put up a very resolute defense in Gaza, which remained in Egyptian hands. Now, after October of 1948, the Israelis had a significant advantage, and they were able to push further and further south towards Beersheba and liberate it from Egyptian control. And in fact, they were able to push so far, they were even able to cross the boundaries into the Sinai and take Sinai territory before pulling back into the Mandate territories. Again, Ben Gurion did not want to ostracize Westerners, and an invasion of Egypt territory proper was seen as something that could provoke that. We see similar things like this in the current war between Ukraine and Russia, where Ukraine knows that it really can't invade Russian sovereign territory because that would alienate the United States and their support. the Egyptians were actually the first ones to really pull out of the war, to really see this war as a loss on their part. And so they were beginning to be willing to discuss possibilities for an armistice. And in order to facilitate this, the Americans sent Ralph Bunche, who is an absolutely fantastic representative of a UN diplomat, as well as an African-American civil rights pioneer in the 1940s. And he convened a council in Rhodes in February of 1949, and he sat the Egyptian and Israeli delegations together. And the Egyptian delegation would only talk to Bunche; they would not talk to the Israelis. And there's a joke that an Israeli sneezed, and an Egyptian said, "God bless you," and it was the only communication between the two sides at that meeting. But despite this hardship, Bunche was actually able to get an armistice agreement signed between the parties. Yeah, there's a point here that Ralph Bunche is from Detroit, and he may well have been the first African-American in the Foreign Service. Absolutely phenomenal individual. Okay. So after the war, you end up with this situation where about 720,000 Palestinian Arabs have fled the country, and they exist in a number of different places. And a number of Palestinian villages that had existed before the war were either destroyed or inhabited by Zionist settlers afterwards. And Israel imposes a number of laws that prevent them from returning. And then in 1952, they solidified the terms by which Palestinian citizens who remained could become citizens. And that's the Citizenship Law of 1952. That law also includes the famous right of return law that affects whether Jews can become, for Jews, the right of return law of 1950 solidified that right, but Palestinians do not have a right of return to Israel. Despite this, there were a number of different issues that Palestinian citizens of Israel had to contend with. The first was that most Palestinian citizens of Israel lived in specific Palestinian cities. These are places like Nazareth, al-Fahm, and other places like that, where the majority of the population is Arab. There are some mixed cities like Haifa and Akko, but by and large, these cities are Arab cities, and the Arab cities were under martial law, and that martial law existed until 1966. Despite living under martial law, Palestinian citizens of Israel could vote and could be represented. And in fact, you can see Saifuddin Zobi, who was a Palestinian citizen of Israel and a member of the first Israeli Knesset, or parliamentary coalition. It wasn't until, despite the fact that Palestinian citizens of Israel have been represented in the Knesset, in the parliament, they have never been part of a governing coalition until the last 5 or 6 years. Much more common of the Palestinian citizen of Israel experience is the experience of Tawfiq Ziad. Ziad was a poet who came from the north of Israel, and he wrote quite vociferously about the nature of occupation. And as we remember from our discussions, poetry tends to be a motivating political force among Arabs. And because of that, he was jailed by the Israeli government. He alleges that he suffered torture, and he has written further about that. But as an Israeli citizen, he has significantly more rights to combat this than most Arabs might, and especially from other regimes. And so he was able to continue writing despite being in prison. If memory serves, I believe he died from the treatment he received. But those are for the roughly 100,000 or so Palestinians who stayed within the territory of the nascent state of Israel. 720,000 fled. And so you end up having this diaspora, which is preceded over by the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Work Organization, which is the first refugee organization and operates entirely separately from the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. This meant that Palestinians would be in these camps and be perpetual refugees. The Egyptians tried to support what they called an all-Palestine government, which was created from the remnants of al-Husseini's militant faction, the Holy Jihad Army. And that government was not recognized by Jordan, which did what it had always planned to do, which was to annex the West Bank. And by and large, the Palestinian identity as the Palestinian political element was limited. Despite that, as you can see, the all-Palestine government, which was a puppet government of Egypt, managed to produce its own passports and had its own degree of quasi-independence until Egypt annexed it in 1959. Now, the Palestinians who lived in these camps often did not have the same rights as individuals in the countries in which they said. Jordan is going to be a unique example I'm going to explain in a minute. But in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Egypt, they did not have rights of residency, they did not have work permissions, and they did not have the ability to acquire citizenship or give citizenship to their children, which meant that they would be stuck in this perpetual statelessness despite living theoretically in a state. Now, Jordan in particular had a unique policy. Now, the West Bank, despite its small size relative to the rest of Jordan, was roughly a third to half of the population of the new Jordanian state. And in fact, King Abdullah was invited by a number of Palestinian families in Jericho to discuss the possibility of annexation and their homage to him, the same way that he had taken homage of many of the townships in what was formerly Jordan. Now, accordingly, King Abdullah, considering that he thought the West Bank should be part of his country, considered giving the people citizenship. And so you can see in his nationality law of 1954, anybody who was a Palestinian prior to 1948 and wasn't Jewish, right? Jews were not permitted Jordanian citizenship. And Jews are still, as far as I'm aware, not allowed to purchase land in Jordan. But so any Palestinian person who was now a resident of the Kingdom of Jordan between December 1949 and February 1954, so that those years when Jordan is at peace with Israel, at ceasefire with Israel, let's say, would become a citizen of Jordan. And this is important because Jordan will see an influx of new refugees in 1967, and it will see the separation of the West Bank from Jordan in 1987. So in 1987, this portion is curtailed a little bit, such that anybody who still stays in the West Bank loses their Jordanian citizenship and becomes Palestinian. So, but this creates a unique situation where the refugees in 48 are citizens, but the refugees in 67 are not. And so you have both existing in Jordan. And in fact, Jordan's largest population today is ethnic Palestinians who make up the majority of the country. In 1951, King Abdullah I was appearing to make underhanded channels to achieve peace with the state of Israel. And while he was on that trip, he was assassinated by a Palestinian, leading to the succession of his son, Talal, and then Talal being removed for mental instability, and his son, the grandson of King Abdullah I, coming to power, and that's Hussein, who remains king of Jordan for nearly 40 years. At the same time as we have this situation in with the Palestinians, we also have a recurrent situation in the Arab world, where Jews are subject to numerous persecutions from the Arab countries in which they were living. And so a significant percentage of them decide to leave those countries of origin. Around 850,000 of them leave or are expelled, depending on how strongly you see the push factors as being. And of that 850,000, 500,000 end up in the new state of Israel, which, to give a scale of how big that was, we're talking about a country of about 700,000 people receiving another 500,000 people in the space of 7 years. It was one of the biggest changes in population conceivable. And the Israeli government ended up building what were called the ma'aborot, or the camps, that existed throughout the Negev desert in order to house this population while they continued to settle them. We also see a fundamental shift within the religious community as concerns Israel. Now that Israel is an existing state, an existing entity, the Orthodox around the world begin to question exactly how they can square the circle here. And Rabbi Menachem Schneerson and Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik basically come to the consensus that while they can't support Zionism as a secular ideology, a refutation of the Messiah, all these kinds of things, what they can support is fellow Jews. And they recognize that Israel, if not a Jewish state, is a state of Jews. And so Israel should be supported under that understanding and with that piece of consideration. And increasingly, we see Torah learning beginning to crop up in the nascent state of Israel. When Ben Gurion founded the state, he only gave life ministries to the Orthodox. That's things like marriage, funerary rituals, things like that. And the Orthodox were about 10% of Israel's population. That number has risen significantly since then. And with that has also risen the level of Israeli orthodoxy, the institutions that exist, and the recognition by Orthodox of Israel as being a special place, regardless of the regime governing not being one that they accept as religiously legitimate. There was a point here that Yemeni Jews were airlifted to Israel and that Ethiopian Jews were also airlifted to Israel. Those are both absolutely correct. The Ethiopian airlifts were somewhat separate from the Mizrahi Exodus, as they were less due to push factors and more due to pull factors. But both of those missions required Israel to engage in an incredible maneuver, which was refueling in the air. It was known and was attempted by several more advanced militaries like the United States, but the degree to which Israel used it was quite incredible for this period. All right, questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. While those are heating up, let me tell you a little bit about our group history, mostly ancient discussions. We are a group that does a lot of different pieces, and I do the Middle Eastern Islamic history, which you've just attended. Next week, we are going to talk about British Iraq and how that formed and what its goals and aspirations were. We also discussed Greco-Roman civilization and Asian philosophy, Greco-Roman philosophy. Aaron and I just had our meeting on European Union security, which somehow became a Ukraine meeting. But we'll have a normal one on the 11th of December. We have our Powerful Women series with a lecture that is very close to upcoming. I don't have the date on me. And we have our Ukrainian War series, which we should resume sometime in January. And all right, so we had a question earlier about let's see. Is Jesus technically from Nazareth? This is one of those strange things where the Bible's trying to square the circle here. So the prophecy in the Old Testament is that the Scion of David will be born in Bethlehem. So two of the Gospels argue that Jesus is born in Bethlehem in order to agree with that. And two of the other Gospels argue that he was born in Nazareth. So if it is Nazareth, then it's that Nazareth. If it's Bethlehem, then it's Bethlehem. And this is also assuming that Jesus is a historical person. There's debate as to whether he historically existed, or if even if he did, the degree to which the Gospels accurately render elements of his life, even the non-miraculous elements of his life. There's a question of how many different sects, divisions, categories of Jews are there, particularly in Israel. I think the best point on this is one Jew, three opinions. So I don't really think that there's any, rote categorization of how many categories and sects there are in Israel. But I would actually say that American Jewish diversity is probably greater than Jewish diversity in Israel. And that's because in America, there's a lot more permission, at least socially, for different levels of religiosity. In Israel, you're generally speaking either chiloni or secular, or you're dati, religious. And within those categories, there are numerous subcategories, but the idea of reform or conservative, these things exist in Israel, but have a very small following, whereas in the United States, you have a much more even split across the different levels of religiosity. I also have a comment that's asking to explain why the different Arab proto-states couldn't come together. There's a lot of this, and I'm probably going to talk about it a lot more in 2023, but the main points are as follows. Different Arab states had different foreign policies that they wanted to pursue. You had groups like the Lebanese and the Syrians who wanted to have a more Western perspective. You had ones like Egypt, which wanted to go after a pan-Arab expression, which would require the sublimation of other regimes to Egypt, basically. You had the Iraqis who were meddling with something that was a little bit more socialist and perhaps more in the Soviet sphere under Abdel Karim Qasim. And then between Syria and Iraq, you have the Ba'ath, who are in direct opposition to the Arab socialists of Egypt. So you had a lot of these different feuds between different leaders where they didn't really trust each other, and they didn't really trust the aspirations of other fellow Arab leaders. The other thing is that these Arab proto-states did not have, in many cases, a stable government. Jordan is the one counterexample here, where the Jordanian monarchy that existed in 1921 is still the Jordanian monarchy that exists in 2022. Syria, between 1948 and 1969, I want to say, had something like 20 different governments. Lebanon was a little more stable than that, but then it collapsed into civil war in 1975. Yemen was part of a civil war between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Iraq had a coup in 1958, a second coup in 1963, a third coup in 1967, a fourth coup in 1969, I think. So none of these governments are very stable, and each time the government flips, it takes a wildly, radically different foreign policy and domestic policy. And so there's not this cohesion that builds between the different Arab states and the different Arab leaderships, regardless of whether the pan-Arab sentiment is felt collectively by the Arabs. And I actually believe it isn't. I believe that that's more of a farce. But there's certainly a better case that Arabs believe in pan-Arabism than Arab leaders believe in pan-Arabism. There's a question of whether secular and religious are allowed to fully participate in citizenship and government and foreign relations of Israel. If anything, I would say the secular Jews have more citizenship powers than the religious do, simply because of numbers. And the political parties of Israel, the most powerful political parties in Israel in terms of numbers are secular parties. Both the Labor Party, which now is basically defunct, but was the dominant left-wing party in Israel until the 1980s, maybe 1990s, and the Likud, or Conservative Party, which sort of started in the 1970s and is the reigning party today, are secular parties. They were formed by the Chilonim, the secular Jews. That's not to say that religious parties don't have political power. Religious parties do. And oftentimes they've been the swing vote in coalition building. So they've had disproportionate power despite their small size. Within Israel, like most other Middle Eastern countries, religion is a point of identity. That is to say, it is a fact that goes into certain civic rights and responsibilities. Now, secular Jews in Israel, the Chilonim, are required to be drafted for the military, both men and women, although the male draft term is longer. Religious Jews, the Datim, are also required to submit for the draft, but they are given a number of exemptions. The community is given a number of exemptions in order to allow them to do Torah study. This is part of the negotiation that has gone on in Israel's coalition building process. And other religious communities in Israel have different draft requirements. Circassians and Druze, the men are conscripted, the women are not. Arab Christians, Arab Muslims, and Bedouins are not conscripted or draft conscripted. They can all volunteer, and Bedouins have a high rate of volunteerism. Arab Christians and Arab Muslims have a low rate of volunteerism. All right, so thank everybody for the kind words, and I'll close it out. All right, good night, everybody.